You are here on the First Down Podcast. Now, today, we have Week 9 Waiver Radar. Starting with quarterback. This week, I like Carson Wentz. Now, Wentz is rostered in 32.9% of ESPN leagues. And the interesting thing about Wentz is that he's only had 1 week this season with less than 17 fantasy points. Only 7 other quarterbacks in fantasy have done that this season. So, he's pretty low owned and has some favorable matchups upcoming against the Jets and Jacksonville. And if you're looking for a bye week fill in, or maybe you had Russell Wilson and you still need a quarterback to fill in, I think Wentz is really a good option. He's been pretty consistent and can get you, the points that you need to win your fantasy matchup. Quarterbacks I look to drop are Matt Ryan. Matt Ryan was on my drop list last week and I think had a mere 6 points last week and has another tough matchup this week upcoming. So looking now at running backs, I have 2 guys that I'm looking at. The first is Adrian Peterson, now a Tennessee Titan. Peterson's rostered in 0.1% of ESPN leagues. I mean, he was a free agent, so that is no surprise. But yesterday he signed with the Titans after the news of the Derrick Henry injury, which if you had Derrick Henry, it's really devastating to your team. But if you're able to snag up Adrian Peterson, I think he can offer a decent amount of fantasy points on a week-to-week basis. I would anticipate 12 to 15 touches a game could offer you good value if you're able to pick up Adrian Peterson. And Peterson, even in his years after the Vikings, he's been relatively productive, even though he's already 36 years old. Now, the second running back I'm looking at is Alex Collins of the Seattle Seahawks. Now, Collins is rostered in 48.9% of ESPN leagues, and in relief of Chris Carson, he's had at least 10 touches each of the past 5 games. And there's a lot of reporting on Chris Carson's progress, and it's really not promising. Now, Collins has been starting for Carson for a couple weeks, but I think now is really the time to buy into Alex Collins, mainly because, Chris Carson has a neck injury, and, neck injuries are, they can be very dangerous, very sensitive area. And I'm not sure, there's talk that Carson doesn't even come back to play this season. So if that's the case, that really offers a lot of value for Alex Collins. And he's been a relatively productive back in relief. So something to consider. Running backs you could drop this week. The first is Devin Singletary. He's been on my drop list for weeks and weeks and weeks and has not proved me wrong on that. So you can continue to drop him. As well as Jamal Williams. He's been out, I think, for a week or 2. But even when he was playing, he's just not getting enough touches. He's productive when he touches the ball, but DeAndre Swift's really carrying the workload there. So I think it's safe to drop Jamal Williams. Now at wide receiver, I have 2 wide receivers. The first is Rashad Bateman of the Baltimore Ravens. Bateman was on my waiver radar last week. The Ravens were on bye, but I said, he was a good target to look at. And I still believe that is so. He's only rostered in 19.5% of ESPN leagues, and he had 12 targets in his first 2 games as a rookie. And he has some pretty favorable matchups upcoming with the Vikings, Dolphins, and the Bears. All 3 teams have a pretty weak secondary, so I could see some potential for Rashad Bateman. The second wide receiver I'm looking at is Elijah Moore of the New York Jets. Moore is rostered in 11.8% of ESPN leagues. He's had 6 targets over each of the last 2 games and has averaged 8 fantasy points over those 2 games. So Moore, kind of a gadget type player. They use him in the run game a little bit. But he can be an explosive player, and the Jets really want to use him as a weapon. The Jets quarterback, in relief of Zach Wilson, White, I think it's Mike White, was performed very, very well this past week against the Bengals, and it seems like he will start this coming week. I believe they play Thursday night. So he's really a good target to look at for the rest of the season, as I see a big role for him in that offense. Receivers that you can drop, Robbie Anderson, similar to Devin Singletary. I don't think Robbie Anderson is. I think he's maybe only had one game over 50 yards receiving. So Robbie Anderson's really has struggled this season, and I think it's safe to say you can drop Robbie Anderson. Laviska Shenault, he was on my drop list previously in the season, had a couple okay games, but nothing really to show for in fantasy recently. And the last is Jacoby Myers. Now Jacoby Myers is over 70% owned in fantasy. The thing about Myers is he hasn't had a game over 10 fantasy points the entire season. It doesn't seem like the Patriots look for him in the red zone at all, and he's just not really getting enough of the target share otherwise to really warrant his ownership at this time of the season. And I think there's definitely more interesting options, so I think you'd be safe to drop Jacoby Myers. At tight end, I have a new tight end to talk about this week. Pat Freiermuth, I believe that's how you say it, of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, Freiermuth is rostered in 8% of ESPN leagues, but he's had 7 targets in each of his last 2 games. Now, Freiermuth is a rookie. It seems like maybe he's possibly finding his groove, finding a rhythm with Ben Roethlisberger, and Roethlisberger has seemed to look his way in the red zone. I think Freiermuth's caught a touchdown or 2. So I think going forward at a position where you're lacking a lot of decent options, I think Freiermuth's definitely a good option, not only for this week, but for the rest of the season. Tight ends you can drop. Robert Tonyan. I've talked about Robert Tonyan. He had a big game, or a good game, the previous week against Washington, had his first touchdown, but this week he followed it up with another dud. And that's what I see for the rest of the season for Robert Tonyan. I don't see a lot of fantasy production. I believe he only had 4 targets. There are better options at tight end. And the same goes with Hunter Henry. Last week I talked about Hunter Henry on my drop list and how he had 4 straight games of touchdowns. And this week he broke that streak and did not have a touchdown. I had, I think, 2.3 fantasy points. So that's more of what I see from Hunter Henry the rest of the season. So I would look definitely at Pat Freiermuth. Now at kicker, I have Daniel Carlson. Carlson's rostered in 38.7% of ESPN leagues. He is currently 7th among kickers in fantasy before his bye week. And he has some favorable matchups coming up in the Giants and the Chiefs. So I expect the Raiders to move the ball. Carlson will get opportunities, and he's really just been a good kicker this season, and I expect him to finish in the top 10 in fantasy this year. So if you're looking for a kicker to just plug and play for the rest of the season, I would look at Daniel Carlson. Kickers to drop. I would drop Brandon McManus. The Denver offense has really struggled recently. And McManus, benefited from the Broncos, early season favorable matchups against the Texans, Jets, and Giants. So I would move on from Brandon McManus. Lastly, with defense, I think the defense to really snag up if they're available in your league is the Dallas defense. Their roster's in 48.9% defensive league, so right below that 50% threshold that we look at. And they have some favorable matchups upcoming against Denver and Atlanta, two offenses that have really struggled at times. And on top of that, Dallas's defense has actually played very well this season. They have the leading interception defensive player in Trayvon Diggs, and they've really played well and above expectations, and I expect more of that the rest of the season. Defenses you can drop are both the Bengals and Broncos. Both teams, a struggle, or the Bengals really struggled last week against the Jets in what people thought was a favorable matchup. I think I might have had them on my waiver radar, but regardless, the Broncos also, they play Dallas next week. Not a great matchup, and they just traded away their best defensive player in Von Miller, so I don't really expect much out of the Broncos or Bengals defenses the rest of the way. So that's my waiver radar for this week. Like and subscribe to the podcast. Check out the YouTube channel. Check out the Twitter page at the First Down Pod. And I will see you next week.